chance to preach at the cathedral in Singapore, and there were about 1,500 people there for the 3 services on the Sunday morning. So yes, I do work on my holidays. And one of the wonderful things was they were doing a series on the 10 Commandments. I happened to get number 7, thou shalt not commit adultery. So I think on one hand the rector was very pleased to have a visiting preacher handle that text. Often because in church sometimes people feel very awkward about sex and money. So I said during that sermon, this morning we're going to talk about sex. So again, you have to come back to hear that sermon. But Jesus feeds the 5,000. What a wonderful text. I wanted to put this in context for you. There probably, in this area of Galilee, there were various groups of people, various ethnicities. There were Orthodox Jews, there were people living there from Roman background in Asia Minor and all sorts of things. Sea of Galilee, in fact, to show the Roman influence at this time, had been renamed the Sea of Tiberias, after the Roman emperor. And so the Jews were feeling very much under the Roman footprints with their own kings like Herod and others, but also the effect of Pontius Pilate in Jerusalem, and just the oppression that felt. Heavy taxation they were charged that literally took food out of the parents' and children's mouths, and it went in taxation, and they never saw a benefit for it. Those of you who follow what's going on in Nigeria and other places in Africa and around the world, one of the great challenges for those governments is to use the resources like oil so that the money doesn't go into politicians' pockets but actually benefits the whole people. And when it doesn't happen, you have this unrest. And that's Galilee at this time. People were very upset that their children literally were starving because of the heavy taxation to the Romans. And you had different reactions to this. Some said, God's dead. And they were feeling very frustrated and somewhat hopeless in the abject poverty of their own lives. And living day to day was a chore. You also had faithful Jews who looked back to their own history. Moses, for example, who led the children of Israel out of slavery in Egypt, and which they celebrated a Passover, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But the Jews were echoing the cries of the psalmist, God, where are you? Send us a prophet to set us free from the oppression and to let us know that you exist, that you are real, and that you love us, that you haven't forgotten us. And isn't that the cry of the human heart? Not just about God, but about others, to know that we are loved by others and by God. And this is one of the desperate cries of the people at this time. And that's why they're anxiously looking for a prophet, a sign that God is with them and hasn't forgotten them. Perhaps the most devastating thing that can happen to a person is to feel that no one loves you and no one cares whether you disappear or live or draw breath or not. It's a horrible thing. Last year, we had a mission team in Kenya, and we were doing medical clinics in Nairobi. Nairobi happens to have the largest slum in Africa. It's about, or informal community, it's about 800,000 to 1 million people. They live in abject poverty. It's probably some of the worst poverty I've ever seen. Most people live in cobbled together shacks made of bits of tin and plastic over wood. Perhaps some have mud and wattle on the walls. There are open sewers that run right beside. There's no water, there's no electricity. It's a very difficult place to live. And in the midst of that, you have 800,000 to 1 million people who are incredibly inventive and work hard. They've come to the city hoping for a better life. It is difficult. Most of them are trying to feed up to 6 people under $1 a day. Most of the children don't get a chance to go to school. They have to be sent out to beg in order to have food. And many people only eat once every 2 days. In fact, when we were giving out medication to people, one of the things we had to do quietly was give them a food pack of at least 3 days' food because they hadn't eaten, and you can't take the medication, some of it, without having food. It says take with food, right? But if you don't eat, or eat every couple of days, how can you take the medication? So it was an issue we had to deal with by providing food packets to people who were getting that kind of medication. And so you go into a place like this and you meet people who are working very hard, but the poverty is grinding. One of the places we went on a Sunday morning for worship was a church called Emmanuel Church. It's run by in this case, the Anglican Church. It's located in the middle of one of the parts of the Kibera Korogocho slum. It's a little mud church with a school, a small nursery school with about 80 to 100 children who attend there. And we had a chance to visit there, and a couple of things were noticed. Number one, they were doing incredible work with a very, very poor part of the community. I mean, people were desperate in many cases. They were trying to give food to children so that they would attend school. But the problem with the feeding program was this, that for children who could contribute something, they were able to put together some food, but it wasn't enough for everyone. And so if you could contribute some food, you came to school and you got lunch. If you couldn't contribute, you didn't have lunch. So I remember going to a school and watching this in action. In this particular school, there were about 350 children. About 2/3 of them had to sit there at lunchtime and watch 1/3 eat. Can you imagine being the 2/3? Now, some of the people who went to that church said, we've got to do something about this. And I'm not going to embarrass them by mentioning who they are, but they're members of our congregation. They came back and they said, I've got to respond to the poverty and do something to feed these children. So these two schools that we went to, they wrote a letter to their fellow insurance brokers, and they raised over $7,000 to $8,000. And so that money was used to set up 3 new feeding programs. So the children in Emmanuel and Holy Trinity and a place called Madeline ACK, the children who go there, and they add it, when you add it all up, it's about 600 children, will now get a small breakfast and a lunch for a full year. Everyone. You see, they responded to God's call on their hearts, just like that question to Philip. Philip, what are you going to do about feeding these people? It's not just enough to say, they're hungry, what are we going to do? Remember Jesus' question back to him? Philip, what would you suggest? Well, when the mission member went and saw God move their hearts, they raised funds, and I was pleased to be there at Emmanuel again with those 3 of the same people, and I saw the lunch being prepared. In this case, 80 to 100 little bowls with rice and beans ready to be handed out to the children. And so the parents were now sending their children on a regular basis because their kids were fed in school. Now, the other reason we were there was to give a new library to this school. 1,000 books went in. This place is so dangerous that the diocese sent us with 2 armed police officers as we went in. Now, these are hardcore cops who very often are associated with being corrupt, carrying automatic weapons. So we walked in with them. Last time I'd gone in, I actually went in by myself without any escort. So it was kind of funny going back with the police. But I'll tell you about those 2 guys in a minute. Because we got the books. This was our first project of 10 libraries that were being set up with books donated by people from this congregation and friends in the other community. When I arrived in Kenya initially, 2 days before the team was coming for the libraries, I discovered that although we had sent the books 3 months earlier from Canada, and about 11,000 books had been processed, a total of 13,000, they'd been sent. They were sitting on the dock in Mombasa. That's about 12 hours away by truck from where they needed to be. This is 2 days before the project's beginning to think, and I'm sitting to myself thinking, we've been working on this for 8 months. If the team arrives, we've got the library shelves built and no books. And so I met with the local Kenyan priest and so on, and we prayed and said, God, would you work a miracle here? Because this is going to be a miracle. I don't know if you can understand, having something stuck in customs in Mombasa, it's really hard to get it out. So we prayed. The team arrived on Tuesday night. We were due to start the first library at 10 a.m. on Wednesday morning. I got word on Wednesday morning the books arrived in Nairobi at 6 a.m. from Mombasa. Amen. Do I believe in prayer? Yes. Does God work in very practical ways? Yes. Just like the feeding of the 5,000. God does amazing things. So we got the books, the first 1,000 in barrels, trucked them into this school. The road ends in the middle of the slum. You have to walk about another 150 meters down these kind of tracks. It's a bit of a maze. And we got into the school, dropped the books off, and with these two police officers, now they're really hardcore guys. They're sitting there and their eyes are open because they're starting to wonder, why are you giving these books to people you've really never met before to help children you don't know? And they're beginning to wonder, what is going on here? Because you see, they're used to doing things for money and for benefit. And here's being confronted with giving generously without expectation of return. Now, someone had donated 2 teddy bears, 2 white teddy bears, and we asked the police officers, do you have children? And so they started to talk about their children. And so I said, would you like to take a teddy bear home for your young children? And the hardness just melted, and they started to smile. It was quite moving. And so I gave each one of them a teddy bear, and so they're holding in one arm their automatic weapon, the other arm is the teddy bear. I thought for a briefest moment, I'd love to have a picture of this because nobody's going to believe it. But you know, when we left that Emmanuel, those guys' lives were changed because they'd seen the love of God in action. Just like those who'd been fed in the feeding of the 5,000, they'd seen Jesus in action, his love. And they ate and were blessed. Now, I want to tell you just briefly, because we're doing a baptism this morning, about a fellow named Anton who I met. I was doing a meeting, visiting CMS, Church Missionary Society in Oxford. It's their world headquarters. The person I was meeting with was a fellow named Anton. He's Russian. He actually comes from the Russian Orthodox Church. And I asked him, how did you come to Christ? How did God touch you in the middle of Russia? He told me that both his parents were nuclear engineers, and by the way, they worked on the sister plant to Chernobyl. That's where they worked. And such was the case when he was growing up that the priest, the Russian Orthodox priest, had to actually go and do baptisms in secret. And so they were sent to visit, his sister and himself were sent to visit with his grandmother for a summer holiday. He went with his sister, and the grandmother took him to the local church, and the priest happened to be passing through doing a circuit, and he had to do it secretly. And so they were baptized in secret, and they couldn't tell their parents they'd been baptized because the government would likely have stripped them their jobs from them. It would have been a very negative thing. And that was his first encounter with God. He was secretly baptized, and he couldn't tell anyone. But God continued to touch his life through the years. And through a long journey, he said, I came to the place where I recognized it was harder not to believe in God than to believe in God. Very much like C.S. Lewis. And he said, as I prayed that Christ would come into my heart was deeply warmed, and I was transformed by his love. And that was a long journey through atheism in what was the Soviet Union at that time. And so the guy who was driving me around Oxford was somebody who had been touched, first of all, in a secret baptism at a very small rural church in the Soviet Union, but God had never forgotten him through the years. So as we come for baptism this morning, God is going to do something wonderful and has been. He knows each adult and child by name, just like he knows each of us. And he loves us so much that he wants us to draw closer to him. And so the journey that we celebrate this morning will continue as we follow him in faith and love.